Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library. I'm really thrilled to be here with thriller writer Don Bentley. Yes, I use thriller twice in that one sentence, and I love it. So we're going to be talking about his books and writing process and publishing journey in just a minute. But before we get to that, I wanted to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programming. I would also like to thank Don because he let us partner with other libraries for this program. And, when libraries get together and do things, it's magic. So Don helped us make magic. So I'd like to welcome the patrons from Ashland, of course, Hanover, Needham, Rowley, Tewksbury, and Woburn. So very thrilled to have you all here. And you can buy signed books from Don from Aesop's Fables. I will put the link in the chat for that. And I, of course, think that signed books are gold. I'm pretty sure everybody here agrees with me. So Don, met him online a few months ago when he participated in an online auction for us. And I just was astounded by your books and your history and everything. You've been in the military, you've been a SWAT member, you've gotten awards. It's just on and on and on. So tell us more about yourself and then of your latest book, and then we'll get right into a Q&A.
Okay. Yeah. So thank you so much for having me, Mina. It's nice to put a face to a name, and then obviously to be able to do this event. I do have a bit of a checkered background, I guess. My wife likes to say that I couldn't figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I think there is a certain amount of truth to that. But the thing that is common across all of those is I knew I always wanted to be a storyteller. And so even I'm a kid of the 80s, and there was some magnificent TV when I was growing up, titans of the TV making industry with names like Airwolf and the A-Team and Knight Rider. And so I remember being a little kid and watching those, you too, and thinking this was really neat, but what if this would have happened instead? And so, I remember being probably in third or fourth grade or something the first time and writing an alternate ending to like a Star Trek episode or something like that. And so it took me a while to be able to get the tools in my toolkit that allowed me to tell the stories that I wanted to tell in a way that was good enough for people to want to buy them. So I wrote 3 books over 17 years that didn't sell before my first book, Without Sanction, sold in the 2-book deal. And so if you discount those 3 books in that 17 years, I'm pretty much an overnight success. But yeah, it's been a really fun journey to be here. And the last thing I'll say on it is when Without Sanction first came out, I was doing a radio interview, and the interviewer she was trying to pin me to the wall, and she said, "Are you Matt Drake?" Who's my protagonist, Matt Drake. And I said, I'm absolutely not him, but I've stood in the same room with men who could be. And so that, I think, has been the biggest benefit of my crazy life, is that I got to meet some really, really interesting people, and now some of them are characters in my books.
Which was one of my questions, actually. So I think your most recent book was Forgotten War, I believe.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Forgotten War is the 4th book in my Matt Drake series. And if you're new to me or new to this, you can jump in the series at any book. They can all be read as standalones. Now, my 3 kids, 2 of which are in college and one that's heading that way, would love it if you started with the first book and worked through, but you don't need to do that. And so my character, Matt Drake, is what's called a case officer, which is a fancy way of saying he's a spy, and he works for the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, which is an agency that's very similar to the CIA that you've probably heard of before, but has a different command structure. It works through the military. And so in real life, these agencies fight all the time. They fight over mission and over resources. And I thought, man, that would be really, really interesting to have a character who is a little bit the same but different. My editor for my books, both for my Clancy books and my Matt Drake books, is a fantastic guy named Tom Colgan. And he said, when you're a new debut author coming to fiction, you need to do something that's the same but different. And so what he meant by that is Brad Taylor is a fantastic writer. He writes the #1 New York Times Bestselling Pike Logan series, and he's a good friend of mine. And our books should be shelved in the same area, but I'm never going to write a better Brad book than Brad does. And so I had to make some decisions to say, what can I do that's the same, but different. And so Matt Drake being a spy, Matt Drake working for the Defense Intelligence Agency, some other things we can talk about later to go in more detail. But for the fourth book, as I was sitting down to write it, it was the summer of 2021, and it was our withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I am a veteran in Afghanistan. I went from 2005 to 2006 as an air cavalry troop commander. So I was an Apache pilot. And so I had some pretty intense feelings watching what I looked at as 20 years of blood and treasure and sacrifice just turning to ash in front of our eyes. And so as writers do, I kind of process that through a book, and the book is Forgotten War. And so at its core, Forgotten War is a story that's meant to keep you up way past your bedtime and keep you turning pages when you want to stop. But it also is based on a lot of actual events that either I was part of, friends of mine were part of, and certainly the emotional core of the book, the feelings that the veterans, that the characters in that cast of book express very much mirror the feelings and conversations I had with fellow veterans as Afghanistan was crumbling.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I just need a minute. Thank you. I did forget to tell people, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will be moderating those with Don, or I have plenty. So you can just sit back, relax, and enjoy. Use the chat to chat with each other and talk about whatever we're talking about if you would like. So I want to talk about Forgotten War because it seems like it was pretty close to you, but I want to go back a little bit to your sort of origin story. So when you knew you wanted to be a writer and you wrote those 3 books, did you have an agent? Did you what did you do with them?
Yeah, so I think I started working on my first book maybe while I was still in high school, and had worked in, and I should take a step back and said my senior year in high school, I had a fantastic English teacher. And one of the times where she gave us an assignment to write a scene or something like that, she pulled me aside afterwards after she'd read mine and said, you could actually do this. You could be a writer. And so I kind of took that advice to heart and went to college and majored in electrical engineering, which is what all good writers should major in. And so I say that obviously somewhat tongue in cheek, but her encouragement really made me believe that I could do it and could kind of finish that first book. And so little aside with that, she has long since retired, but still lives in my hometown. And so when I hit the New York Times bestseller list, I was able to find her, and she comes to all my signings now, which is really, really cool. But it took me, so the first book I finished, I got serious about my writing probably about 2000, 2001, and they may still do this, but at the time, Writer's Digest had these series of online classes that you could take, and they were stuff like, here's the fundamentals of a scene, here is the structure of a novel, and so I took a whole bunch of those, and they were great because you would write something and the cadre on there was somebody who was a published author that would give you feedback, and your classmates were. And so that went a long way, I think, I had the stories I wanted to tell here, but there were some things that I was missing about being a writer that would allow me to bring my writing up to the stories I wanted to tell. And so the first book I finished was in about 2001 or something like that, maybe a little later, while I was still in the Army. And so I got an agent for that book, and she wasn't able to sell it. And so I was in Afghanistan at the time. And while everybody else after mission would go read or play Xbox or do whatever, I was working on my second book. And so I finished that when I got done with Afghanistan. She didn't want that book. I sulked for a period of time, as writers are wont to do. And then eventually found a second agent, and he took it out, and he couldn't sell it either. And so about that time, I really did have a chip on my shoulder that I didn't have an undergraduate degree in writing. And I'll say now, having met so many people, Brad Taylor, like I told you about before, Mark Greeny, many of my friends who are successful do not. but all of them spent some time learning how to be better writers. And you don't have to do that in school. You can do it at writers' conferences. Thriller Fest is a fantastic writers' conference. But at the time I thought, maybe what I'm missing is I don't have a writing degree. And so the military had this incredible GI Bill that I was able to use and go back and get my MFA in writing popular fiction. And then you write, as part of that program, your novel is your thesis. So I wrote my third novel at that time. I'd parted ways with my second agent. And so I said, this is it. I'm going to Thriller Fest for the first time. I have this really cool background. I'd been in the FBI by then. I've got this great book. I have the writing degree. This is it. And so I went and pitched it. A bunch of people asked it and they all said no. And so, it crushed me. Had to sulk some more, came back with the same book again next year. Surprise, surprise. They all said no again. Think I may have even came back with the same book for the third year. And finally, the woman who would become my agent with the fourth book, she's like, you just need to go home and write a better book. And it was a really, really hard thing to hear, because you start, as you're writing this book and it takes you a year of your life or however much, it's hard to let that go. It's hard to believe, hey, this was part of the process you needed in order to get better, to become a writer, and it served its purpose, but it's just not good enough yet. And I think if I would have let go sooner, I could have perhaps been successful in less than 17 years. And so eventually I went home, and another person that was key. So there's a fantastic writer named Nick Petrie that's a good friend of mine. He writes the Peter Ash series. His first book is The Drifter, and he's phenomenal. And so he and I met at Thriller Fest, and it was right at that time when my third book, Nobody Wanted. And so it was supposed to be this chance meeting between the two of us that we were going to talk for 5 minutes. And an hour and a half later, like, I've got my head in his lap, and I'm like, I'm never going to be a writer. And Nick, to his credit, he grabbed me and he said, you're me 2 years ago. And he said, I wrote 3 books that didn't sell. My 4th book sold. Go home and write a better book. And so I did. And that book landed me my agent. And then she sold it in 7 days in a 2-book deal. And that eventually led to me being able to write the Tom Clancy books, and now the Mitch Rapp books, the Vince Flynn, Mitch Rapp books. And so it was a long journey. And I think, just like anything where you are asking somebody to pay you money for your art, it takes a long time to be good enough to get somebody to do that. But I think I could have compressed that some if I'd been willing to listen when people said it's not ready yet, and just written another book.
Pat asks, if you don't mind, would you
let
us know where you went to high school and college?
Yes. So I've been in Texas for off and on for the last 20 years or so. I was stationed here twice, but I live north of Austin now, and we lived here for about 13 years. And so I consider myself a Texan, but I actually grew up midway between Cincinnati and Dayton in Ohio. And then in a high school that's called Lakota. It was one high school now, but it's now, the town's blown up, and that's now 2 high schools. And then I went to college at The Ohio State University in Columbus.
That place is huge. Oh my gosh. So I'm just going to dig a little bit into your past, a little bit more about what made you end up going in towards the military versus going into trying to do a writing career.
Yeah, I guess I never saw those things as exclusive, because many of the writers, so when I first fell in love with the genre, certainly Tom Clancy opened the door to that, but there were many writers who I admired who were military officers who were writing in that. And so Harold Coyle at the time wrote this incredible book called Team Yankee. When I was in ROTC in college, there were a lot of books that we had to read as training to be Army officers. But one of the ones that most impacted me was a fiction book that a guy wrote about a Ranger company in Vietnam called Charlie Mike, and he had been in the military. And so I knew even then that the likelihood of being able to write full-time and earn a living there was pretty minuscule. It is for most writers. Most writers have another job. And so I knew from an early age I wanted to serve. And I think I knew that this kind of stories I wanted to tell were about the military. And so I have people now it's much more common because we were at war for the last 20 years, for folks who write in this genre to have served, or to have served in the intelligence community. But I tell folks all the time, you don't need to have done that. If you look at some of the most successful writers, like Vince Flynn was a bartender before he was a writer. Brad Thor was a travel writer. Tom Clancy was an insurance salesman with a library card. Like literally that was his expertise. And so you don't have to, but you have to be willing to do the research, or to know, kind of going back to my earlier story, I had the pleasure of knowing people as coworkers and customers, and then friends who could be characters in my book. And so that helped a lot. But to me, those two weren't exclusive. I always knew I wanted to go in the military, and I knew I wanted to tell stories.
Mm-hmm. So then, when you had the first books, and they were Matt Drake, and the first two, once you wrote the better book, were they considered successful?
Yeah, so that is one of the hardest questions to figure out as a writer, is the book successful or not? Is it, especially for series books, you know, when I was talking to my new editor, Emily Bessler, she said that most of the time it takes a series 5 or 6 books, between 4 books, 5 books, 6 books, to be able to build that audience big enough for them to kind of be sustained. And so it was great when it came out, and I had a 2-book deal, and then I got another 2-book deal after that, and now I'm at the point where I can write full time and continue to tell those stories. And so I've asked somebody before, they're like, "Are you a success?" I'm like, that's a really good question. I think in a way I'd say that I am, because I'm now able to write full time and I get to tell the stories I want to. I think on the other hand, it's great to be able to meet other writers, because they understand you in ways that even your wife or husband doesn't really, because they don't have that mental problem that makes you a writer like you do. But I think what's really hard too is my last agent used to say all the time, keep your eyes on your own paper, because as writers, what you constantly want to do is like, yes, I finally have a book deal, but they have a 2-book deal, or yes, I've got a 2-book deal, but they can stay home and write, or I can stay home and write now, but they have a TV deal. And so that's the part that's always hard, right? And that's certainly true of anything, but I think writing, the profession, is so much more opaque because many of the contracts have like non-disclosure stuff, or it's much harder to figure out, like, what does success look like what number of books sold, what compensation, whatever. And so it's hard to figure that stuff out and to say, what is success as a writer. But I think that's kind of how I've defined it now, is I get to tell stories for a living and work in a pair of shorts and a t-shirt. So that's not a bad gig.
That's how you do these meetings too.
That's right. That's right.
So I want to talk about Matt Drake a little bit, because he was sort of that early brainchild. How did he come to you? How did he and the DIA come to you?
Yeah, so people ask a lot, are you ever going to try and publish those first 3 books that didn't sell? And it's a very logical question, but if you peel back the curtain, the answer is almost always no. Because say you weren't going to be a writer, say you were going to try and be a woodworker, in your garage there would be all kinds of ugly half-finished things as you're trying to learn, how do I do this joint, how do I get these 2 woods, how do I stain, and you see bits and pieces of things that never came to fruition. And for me, that's what those first 2 books or 3 books were. And Matt first came as a character in the 3rd book. And so even though that book never sold, it kind of gave me him and him as a voice. And he came from a couple different things. So going back to the same but different, when I looked out at this genre, I said, there are a lot of tough guys, a lot of steely-eyed killers with barrel chests and stuff. But there aren't a whole lot of people that make fun of themselves and kind of tell jokes at their own expense. And so one of my favorite writers, Nelson DeMille, was kind enough to blurb Forgotten War. And he's been a huge influence on me as a writer, specifically his John Corey books. And so his first book in the John Corey series is called Plum Island. And I remember when I finished reading it, I told my wife, I'm like, I would read about John Corey getting the oil changed on his car, because he's so funny and that voice is so strong, and it's so gratifying as a reader just to hang out with him. Well, some of the way Nelson DeMille does it is he writes in first person, which is just writer talk for saying that John Corey tells you the story. It's I. And so I thought, I think I could pull that off and do something similar with Matt. And I told my wife that, and she's like, well, you're not that funny. And I'm like, yeah, I know, but if I had the time to write and do all those jokes, maybe I could be. And so that was kind of the first thing I did. And the second part of that is the people I know who could be Matt Drake very often use kind of a gallows humor to diffuse what is a very tense situation, because they are doing things that allow us to sleep in our bed safely at night, right? And so in order to cope with that, many of them have this kind of gallows off sense of humor. And I'm like, I'm going to pull that and use it. The second thing is that when I looked and said, what kind of protagonists are out in this genre, there are a lot of Navy SEALs, there were a lot of CIA assassins, there were a lot of things like that. But when I got out of the FBI, I went to work for a small company that was it was almost all veterans, and most of them were Army veterans from the special operations community. And so 3 of my best friends are all veterans of the Ranger Regiment. And so that was another one where I thought, I haven't seen that in fiction yet. And so I made Matt an Army Ranger as kind of his background. And there's a kind of a creed, and it's called the Ranger Creed, that people from that background live by. And to you and I, it would say like, that seems like something HR thought up. But to these men who served in that regiment, it really is a way in which they order their lives. And I got to see that firsthand and hear their stories. And so the Ranger Creed is very, very important to Matt and plays a pivotal role in Without Sanction. And I think then the final thing, as I was putting Matt together, is I'll go back to Nick Petrie. I don't know if he actually said this or not, but I attribute all wise writing things to Nick Petrie. Is I'm fairly certain when he and I were talking one time, he said, in a good book, what's happening is the writer is trying to answer a question for themselves in the pages of this book. He said, there's something that they're wrestling with, something that scares them, and they're putting it in the book and trying to find the answer as they're writing. And so for me, my first 3 books, I think the protagonists, even though Matt came in the 3rd book, were very one-dimensional, were very kind of stock thriller protagonists. But as a person, I had a bad day in Afghanistan. A lot of folks who served there did. Mine was on June 28th, 2005. And I spent a lot of time after I got out of the Army trying to come to terms with some of the survivor's guilt, some of the questions of like, why am I here and they're not? And what does that mean? And how should I live my life going forward? And I'd shied away from that in my writing before. And like, this is my life. Here are the things I'm writing. And so for the first time in Without Sanction, I'm like, what? I don't know the answer to those questions. So Matt wouldn't know the answers to them anyway. And so when Without Sanction starts, Matt, who's a case officer, it means his job is to run and recruit what in the intelligence community they call assets. When I did the same job in the FBI, we call them sources. And he's just coming back from an operation in Syria that went tragically wrong, in which Matt's asset and was killed, and his best friend Frodo was horribly disfigured, and Matt thinks that it's his fault. And so I think those things coming together allowed me to finally write a protagonist that was a little different, a book that was a little different, and really do that same but different, where you say, yeah, Without Sanction should be in the espionage or military thriller genre, but it's a little bit different. And I like that because, again, nobody can write a better Mark Graney book than Mark can. And so you have to do something a little different.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting. And there's so much to unpack in everything you just said, but I'm going to focus on the voice, because now you're also writing as Tom Clancy who had a very distinct voice. So how do
Yeah.
you write as Tom Clancy, keep your own voice, or do you only keep those in the Matt Drake books? How do you write as somebody who is so iconic?
Yeah, so one of the things I've been really fortunate about is to have the same editor for both my series and the Tom Clancy books. And the reason why I say that's fortunate, I have another writer friend of mine. His name is John Dixon, and he was a Golden Glove boxer. He boxed for Penn State when he was in college, and he said the purpose of a referee in a boxing match is that it's the referee's job to worry about your opponent so you don't have to. You don't ever have to worry about hurting them. You just concentrate on fighting. And I think a really great editor does that for you from a writing perspective, where you push the envelopes absolutely as far as you can, and he or she serves as the guardrail for that book, and they bring it back in. And so if you take that a step further, there are a lot of Toms in this story, so I apologize, but Tom Colgan, my editor, has edited for Lee Child and Janet Ivanovich and Tom Clancy when Tom was still alive. And so he has not only the job of a great editor, he's a great editor, but he is the historical background for all of those books, right? He knows them all. He edited a bunch of them. He knows how the voices should be. And so he kind of serves as the safety net for them. But I think one of the things he said to me when he offered me the opportunity to come write Clancy is he said, you know what, I don't want you to try and write like Clancy. He's like, Clancy was, a once in a generation talent. Nobody can write like him. He said, I just basically want you to write fan fiction in his universe. And so that kind of gave me a lot more, okay, I don't have to be Tom Clancy. I have to just be me, but with his characters. Now, having said that, is with my first Clancy book, my fourth Clancy book is about to come out in September. It's called Weapons Grade. And so it's crazy to me that I'm actually on my fourth one, but my first one called Target Acquired, there were sections in there where my editor, Tom, would come back and he said, this is not how Jack Ryan Jr. would talk, or this is what Matt would say. This isn't what that character would say. And so there was some learning there on my part to be able to distinguish those voices. Again, to do a little writer inside baseball, it helped that my Matt books were first person and that the Clancy books are third, because it felt differently to me. The character felt farther away. Matt's voice comes very easily to me. And so that helped some too, but there was certainly some learning there where I had to figure that out. At the same point, there is, if you read my books, my Clancy books, there are more humor in them than probably what Mike Madden wrote or what Mark Graney did. And part of that is just when you come to a series, an iconic series, it's kind of two things at the same time. Number one, you want to stay true to the series and be respectful of the people who, you're standing on the shoulders of giants, whether it's the original legacy writer or the people, in my case, like Mark Graney and Mark Cameron and Mike Madden, who wrote those books before I did. But at the same time, you have to find some little patch of untilled soil to say, here's what I can explore to kind of make this mine. Because otherwise, we go back to the great 80s TV shows. My son started watching the A-Team when he was 12 or so, watching reruns, and he made it through about halfway through the first season, and then he was done. And I'm like, how can you be done? These are magnificent. And he said the same thing happens every single episode, right? And it kind of does. And so you have to be very conscious of that when you're writing in these legacy things, is that you want to give the fans what they came to that book for without being episodic or repetitive. And so one of the ways that you do that is to find your own little area to say, here's what I'm going to bring to it. And so for me, in Target Acquired, the very first book, I added two characters that were Green Berets that are both based on friends of mine. One is actually a SEAL, and I made him a Green Beret because I'm the writer and I can do that. And then the other one is a Green Beret in real life. But I used them to tell the story, but then actually to add some humor to it, because they're kind of, my wife calls them the two angry Muppets that sit up and heckle in the theater. And so I only meant to use them for one book, and they were so much fun to write, and the fans loved them that they came back. I was like, I think I can make it work in a second book. And now 4 books in, they're in every one of them. And so it wasn't something intentional, but as a writer, you have to bring some of that to those legacy books, because you can't be Tom Clancy. And if you try and write as Tom Clancy, you're going to be a very, very poor imitation. And so that's kind of the balancing act you have to do when you get to write in these legacy series.
So let me step back a little bit and ask, how did you get tapped to write the Jack Ryan books? Jack Ryan, right?
Yeah, the Jack Ryan.
Because you said that there was several people that did it, and like what?
Yeah, I was very lucky. So, and that's partly true. I think what my editor has said is that editors are very wary of authors with their debut books. And what he means with that is that a lot of people can write one book because you have your entire life to write that book. You can revise it as many times. It might be some variant of the same story you've tried to tell over and over again. He said when when you get down to brass tacks is when you write the second book, because you have to write it in a 12-month period. You have to write it. Usually you have your day job as well as your writing job. You're starting to get feedback from your first book. Reviews are coming in, and a lot of times that can mess with you, because when you wrote that first book, you didn't know if anybody would ever read it besides your family member. Now people you don't know are actually reading your books, and surprise, surprise, not all of them are fans. And so you're trying to figure that out. And a lot of people who can write one really good book can't write a second one. And so I was fortunate enough that, number one, he liked my second book in the series, which was called The Outside Man. And then number two, Mike Madden, who had written the books before I did, decided that he didn't want to write anymore. And so my editor was looking for people. And so we had what was called the editorial call, which is when it's kind of like being in 4th grade and you show up and realize you forgot your homework at home. That's what it feels like, because it's your editor's opportunity to take the book and say, here's what worked, here's what didn't work, here's where I think we can fix it. And for a writer at the time, it was nerve-wracking. And part of it is because I thought I had to have all the answers to that. Now I really like that part, because my editor's a fantastic editor and will spitball ideas and stuff back and forth. But anyway, I didn't know I could do that then. And so I got to the end of it and was like breathing a sigh of relief. And he, very Columbo-esque, said, I just have one more question. Would you be interested in writing the Tom Clancy books? And it was, when he said that, it was kind of like I heard this, I'm like, what did he just say? It sounded like the words Tom Clancy. And so that's kind of how it all came about, is I was just fortunate enough he's the writer. So in addition to the Tom Clancy series, Tom is also the editor for the Jason Bourne books and the W.E.B. Griffin books and a whole bunch of legacy series writers. And so that's how I got the gig. And it was also very, very comforting to have him give it to me, because after we went back and forth and I finally figured out I could do it and said yes, then the pressure just falls on you like a stack of bricks, and you're like, holy cow, like I could be the guy that single-handedly derails the Clancy series. Like that could be this guy. And so he was very, as all good editors are, like very reassuring. And he said, listen, you're probably thinking this right now, which I was. And he said, what I want you to know is my superpower as an editor is I pick the right writers for the right books. And I picked you. So you don't have to wonder if you're the right writer, because you are. That's why I picked you. And so it was very much, and he's fantastic. I've loved working with him over these 8 books, but that's kind of how it came together.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So do you have any say in I know there's a Jack Ryan TV show now with oh gosh, what's his name?
John Krasinski.
Yeah. So is that something that you do, or is that something legacy based on?
It depends if that answer is for total strangers or for you and me, because if it's somebody I'm trying to impress, I absolutely have everything to do with that show. The truth is that unfortunately, in my opinion, because I think they could if those were synergized, I think we tell some really great stories in the books, and I'd love to see them more. But the way the Clancy estate works is all of those tentacles are separate entities. So the games, the movies, the books and stuff are all separate. They don't really overlap. At least I should say the books that we write now. Now, certainly they've gone back and made a lot of Tom's original books or based things off of them, but not anything that we've done.
Okay. So well brings up my next question, or Glenn's, which is, do you see Matt Drake being on a streaming service anytime soon?
I see him on a streaming service every night when I say my prayers. I can see him. I can see him on there. In fact, my wife and I'm a huge Friday Night Lights fan, and so I love Riggins, and I think he would be Taylor Kish would be a great one. My wife says that I am too old, and therefore Taylor is too old as well, but she loves the guy Jon Snow, whoever that actor is, for it. But in answer to your question, it's really, really hard to get your book made into a streaming or a movie or something. And so again, going back to two of my friends, so Mark Graney just had his first book, The Gray Man, that was made into a movie. Jack Carr obviously just had The Terminal List made into it. But one of the most successful writers that's a friend of mine, Brad Taylor, every single one of his books has been a New York Times bestseller. He's never had anything made into TV. And that is much more. And in fact, Lee Child, before Tom Cruise made the first one, it was, 10 or 12 or 15 years, I think, before, from when Killing Floor came out to when his first, I forget which one Tom Cruise adapted first, was made for it. And so another good friend of mine is a fantastic writer named Taylor Moore. And so his first book is called Downrange, and it was optioned, and he was super. So option means that, somebody from Hollywood, a producer, somebody like that, has said, I'm going to pay you money for the option to someday make your book into a movie. And so it's for a period of time. It's usually like 18 months. And so Taylor was so excited when they optioned his book, and his film agent sat him down and said, listen, it's great that they optioned it, but you have a better chance of going to Mars than this book is of becoming made into a movie. And he wasn't trying to be mean. He was just trying to level set expectations, because even though the number of movies is so infinitesimally small, that even the streaming service is so small, that it's very, very hard to get one of your books made into a movie. But that doesn't mean I don't hope for that. Absolutely.
I think we do too. Glenn asked one of my favorite questions: are you a pantser or a planner? And I'm going to go even further than his question to say, do you have to do that because you're writing in two different worlds?
Yeah. Yes. So I'll take the second part first. So the two different worlds, the way that worked is, for the last 2.5 years, I had to write a book every 5 months. And so it was really, really exhausting. But it makes you much better at your process, because you don't. So again, I always talk about Brad Taylor. The first time I ever saw him on a panel, when he started out, he was writing 2 books, plus I think 2 novellas, and he was working part of the time too. Every year he was doing this. And so somebody on the panel asked him, do you ever get writer's block? And he was a former Delta Force operator. He was a commando. And so in his steely gaze, he looked back at the person and he's like, I don't have time for writer's block. And there's some truth in that, right? Where if you have that production schedule, you don't have time to second guess yourself. And so you just have to move out, and then you get better at your writing process, where you're spending less time, down rabbit's trails or doing things that are important, because you start to get an inner ear for the story and understand what the beats are and what happens next. Now, the question is usually posed, are you a pantser or a plotter? And Stephen James always changes the pantser to an organic writer, because that makes you sound much more sophisticated. But the truth is that writers tend to fall in one of those 2 categories. You either know what the story is going to be before you start writing, and that's a plotter, you've plotted it out, or you figure out the story, you tell the story to yourself as you're writing the first draft. And I unfortunately fall into that second category. Kyle Mills, who just finished the last Vince Flynn book, and I'm taking over for Kyle. Kyle is famous for his outlines, where he'll write 40 or 50,000 word outlines before he starts writing the book. And then he writes the book very, very quickly because he's plotted it so much. I don't know what the book is going to be about when I start. I usually kind of have the inciting incident, which again is kind of writer speak for, if you think about Star Wars, that moment in time where Luke Skywalker went from just being a water farmer to on the path to being a Jedi, that's the inciting incident, the moment where the story changes. And I usually have an idea about that, but the rest of it kind of comes to me. And so the way that this plays out in real life, especially when I'm writing a book every 5 months, is I'll tell my editor, you know, for my last Clancy book that came out in I don't know, a couple months ago, in June, that was called Flashpoint. I originally told, or maybe actually this story's about Weapons Grade that comes out in September. See, I worked both titles of the book in the same sentence.
Impressive.
Yes. When I got started, my editor said, okay, what's the book going to be about? And Flashpoint had been a very big book that was very global. It took place in Germany, in the South China Sea, in the US. And I said, I think I'm going to write this smaller story in this kind of a Jack Reacher in a small Texas town. And he's like, that's a great idea, write it. And so I started writing it. And 4 months later, when I'm almost done, he sends me an email and he said, hey, based on what you told me, here are some covers to the book we're thinking about. Here are some titles. What do you think? And so I had to write him back and said, those would be great covers if the book I'm writing was at all what I told you it was going to be about. Because now it's going to be about the Iranians trying to hit nuclear breakout. And to his credit, I think, because we had 8 books together, he just wrote me back a 1-line email and he said, good. Does the Iranian facility blow up? Because I'll put that on the cover. And so it was, and that wasn't, like I said, being snarky. Is like, I genuinely do not know when I'm starting the book. And when you have an idea, you don't usually know, is that idea enough to carry the weight of an entire book, right? Because you think, hey, this is pretty interesting, but is it 130,000 words interesting? And for me, you just don't know that until you start writing it. And so that's why I don't ever talk about works in progress, both because I don't know a lot about them, and also because for me, it's very much, I'm also, for a period of time, Bear Grylls and Survivor was very, very popular at my house. And I feel like writing the first draft is very much like kindling that little fire that any wind could come in and blow it out. And so if you open that up and tell other people what you're working in, it just blows out the embers before the fire catches for me.
Interesting. This question from Pat goes way back to the beginning of our conversation about when people told you to write a better book. Did they give you any hints as to what that would look like? Did better plot, characters? She is sorry that she didn't express that better, but she can't figure out exactly what she wants to, how does she want to say that?
Yeah, that's one of the hardest things about writing, is that I kind of liken it, again, going back to woodworking. It's as if you are building a chest of drawers for a customer that you've never met, and you spend a year of your life building this chest of drawers, and you go to sell it to them, and what they give you back is just a form letter that says, not for me, thank you. And so you're thinking, did it not have enough drawers? Did you not like the color? Did you not like the wood? And you don't know a lot. And so that's why it's so important to go to great writers conferences, because what you find there, what I found there, were kindred spirits and other writers who were a little bit further along the path than me. Nick Petrie, when I went home and wrote that better book, he said, send it to me before you send it to your agent, and I'll tell you what I think. And he did. And one of the things, he said a lot of good things, and then he said a really hard thing. He said, I think you have to edit it again. This isn't smooth enough. And then he went through the first chapter and showed me what he was talking about and actually edited it for me. And there was a certain amount of anger at first on my point. And I'm like, how dare you do that? And then when I looked at it, I'm like, he's absolutely right. And I went, and only another writer can tell you that. And most times agents and editors don't have the time to be able to go through and say, especially if it's not clean enough, especially if it is, they may come back and say, hey, I would love to see directionally this happen instead, and so one of the places that you're able to get feedback is writers conferences, whether it's through, a lot of times they'll have things where you can pay to get your book workshopped or a chapter workshop by an author. A lot of times I met 3 of my critique partners. Nick was a critique partner of mine for a while at Thriller Fest. And so that's where you have, because again, there's only so much your spouse is going to be able to tell you, or your friend next door who likes thriller books. At some point, you're going to feel like, hey, I can't ever get it over the goal line. There's something that I'm missing. And usually it takes another writer or an editor or an agent to tell you that. And oftentimes agents and editors are too busy to do that because they get such a huge volume of submissions.
So when you got that chapter back from Nick, what did he feel like would tighten it up? Was it because the plot was too loose, or that wasn't explained well enough? I mean, like, what specifically helped you?
Yeah. So his was more, and I use this every time now, is that I could have said what I was trying to say with fewer words. And so when you look through, when I write, and I used to try to do this in my first draft and make it perfect. And you can't do that because it slows it down too much. But you need to go back and look at your paragraphs and say, can you say that with 3 sentences instead of 5? Can you say that with 5 words instead of 10? Like prepositional phrases, any of that stuff that you can take out, because a reader won't tell you, hey, this is a lot cleaner, but what they will say is, I could check out in this page. And the reason why they check out is because you're using too many words to communicate the point, right? You want to use the bare minimum, because what you want them to do is to turn to the next page. And so you don't want to give them a reason to check out or to look at it and say, especially in this genre, if you look at it, paragraphs are really short, chapters are short, because everything is designed to push the reader to that next chapter. Now, there's certainly other genres that much more are focused on kind of literary writing and wordsmith and stuff like that. In this genre, it isn't. And that's this isn't the question you asked, but when people all the time say, hey, I want to be a writer, what do I do? The first question I always ask them is, what 3 best-selling authors would your book be shelved next to? And if they can't answer that, I'm like, you need to go back and read in the genre that you're trying to write in, because you need to understand the reader is your customer, and you've got to build the chest of drawers that customer wants. And so in order to do the different, you have to know what the same is first. And so for my genre, what readers expect are to be constantly propelled forward, to not have big, bulky pages, the description and stuff like that. And so what Nick went and highlighted through is like, you got too many words here. You have too many adverbs here. You could say this cleaner. This paragraph, you're wandering back and forth. You could actually say this in 1 paragraph instead of 3 paragraphs. And it was very much a cleaning it up from a wordsmithing perspective.
That makes a lot of sense, depending on the genre, because that was my question was, is it because it's a thriller that you have to be much more succinct or precise? Because that's true. We want to turn the page. We want to get to the action. So you sound like you're a voracious reader. And because you've mentioned, it's just like in 50 minutes, you've mentioned like all of my favorite mystery and thriller authors, and some that I haven't heard of. So kudos to you. But do you primarily read the mysteries and thrillers, or is that more of a job thing and you read other genres for pleasure?
So I always read other genres too. I'm a huge fantasy fan as well. I remember even when I was back in high school, like the Dragonlance books and stuff like that, and then certainly the older ones. And then I got to Robert Jordan and a lot of the epic fantasy. And so at first I couldn't even figure. I was going back and forth. Do I want to write fantasy? Do I want to? I like science fiction and stuff. I like a lot of different genres. I read primarily in my genre. I read a lot, but for pleasure, I don't usually. One of my favorite urban fantasy writers is Jim Butcher. And so he does his Harry Dresden series is fantastic. And if you look at it, he structures it like it's a thriller. And so that guy is fantastic about being able to, every chapter he piles something else on his protagonist, and you can just feel him. And so I've taken things from his books that are certainly a different genre of like, how can I do that better with my protagonist? But you have to read and read voraciously in the genre you want to write, because, and this is one of the things I learned in the MFA program, is this notion of close reading, is that you read something first as a reader, and then you go back and read it as a writer and say, where did they get my attention? Where did they lose my attention? How did they work in this scene that, you know, just punched me in the chest when I read it? When my second or third book didn't sell, I took my favorite Vince Flynn book and I broke it down with note cards, scene by scene, and I used a different color note card for every character. And then we lived in a little tiny house at the time, and so I taped it to my bedroom wall. And my wife was less than thrilled with the new decor in our bedroom. But once I had it up on the wall and I could see what Vince did, it was kind of like the difference between looking at a building and looking at the blueprints of the building. You could understand, okay, he only goes 3 scenes without bringing Mitch Rapp back in. And he, you know, and every 4 or 5 would be an action scene. And then he would go back to Irene Kennedy and give her reaction of it. And so then you can start to pick apart how the authors that you love that are successful do what they do. And that is critical to your growth if you want to be a writer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've never met a writer that doesn't read a lot. So probably last question is, I know you're transitioning from writing as Tom Clancy or in the Tom Clancy world to writing in Matt Rapp,
Vince Flynn.
Yeah. Vince Flynn world, I'll say.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how that happens, how you decide you're going to end something, and then how did you end up writing or are going to start writing in another voice altogether?
Yeah, so you give me a little too much credit when you imply that I decided to move from one to another, and just like, I'll write for Vince Flynn next. And so part of it, so Vince Flynn was my favorite writer, and when Kyle Mills took over, I was worried, which I think all the writers were, not because of Kyle, but because you're just like, how can somebody else come in and write these characters the way Vince did? And Kyle just knocked it out of the park. And so I knew that Emily Bessler was the editor, because she's a phenomenal editor. She has her own imprint at Simon Schuster and has like Brad Thor and Vince Flynn and Jack Carr, and then all kinds of other books too. But a lot of times when you get an advanced reader copy of a book, it'll have the editor's email, and they say something like, send me a note. I'd really like to hear what you think. And I don't know if that was supposed to be taken literally, but when I read one of Kyle's books that I loved, I wrote her a note and I said, you know what? He nailed Mitch Rapp in this scene. Like, this could have been Vince writing it. And she was very kind and wrote back. And so I'd done that 5 or 6 times, because again, I'm a huge fan of the books and Kyle did such a good job of it. And so I was getting to the point where I knew coming forward in 2024, I was going to have the opportunity to write a couple different things. And so as I was looking at my books, and then my editor, Tom Colgan, was talking to me about potentially doing a standalone in between my next Matt Drake book. And then we were thinking about how would that work with the Clancy books? And as I was looking at doing another, potentially doing some more Clancy books, I was just thinking, you know what? If I had the opportunity to write any series, it would be the Vince Flynn series. And I'm like, I don't know what to do with that. You know, I'm like, but that is the author that I love. And I know, I didn't know Emily very well, but I knew a lot of her authors and they all loved working with her. And so I said to my agent, I'm like, this is crazy, but I would love to write Vince Flynn. I have no idea whether that's even possible or whatever. And he just said, you know what, it's an agent's job to ask that question. And he's like, so I'll email Emily. And so again, it was, I think everything in life is equal parts showing up and then luck, is that Kyle had decided that Code Red, which is the book that comes out in September, would be his his last Vince Flynn book, and they were looking for somebody else to write them. And so I went through the interview process with that, and talked with Emily and talked with Vince's agent and stuff. And so at the end of the day, I got picked, which is pretty phenomenal. But it is, when I was talking to Mark Graney, has been an incredible mentor for me, because he wrote his own book. He ghost wrote some books. He wrote with Tom while Tom Clancy was still alive, and then took over the series. And he said, if you get the opportunity to write one legacy series and you do it well, it's kind of like the publishing industry puts a stamp of approval on you and says, this is a writer who can deliver. And he said, you will get more opportunities to write in other things as well. And so I think the reason why I was able to, or was selected for the Vince Flynn books, probably had, a large part because I had done the Tom Clancy books, and, I got the Tom Clancy books because I was able to write faster and write a book in a year and stuff. And so that's kind of how all that tied together. As far as the voice, I've been spending a lot of time immersing myself back in the Vince Flynn books again, and reading, really going back to Vince's books originally, because Kyle, like I said, has done some fantastic work in the series, but I wanted to go back to how it all began. And when I first started to experience it as a reader again, right? Because when I got the opportunity to write Target Acquired, my first Clancy book, I literally took out a notebook and wrote at the top, cool things Clancy did, and just started writing, like, as a reader, what were some of the things that I loved about his books. And then I tried not to duplicate that, but to say, as a fan, what would I love to see in this book? What are some Easter eggs I can put in here? What are some, callbacks to other Clancy books that the fans would get in love? And so I'm doing that same thing with Vince Flynn now. I'm a couple months into my first Vince Flynn book will come out in September 2024. And so I'm very much in the writing process now. But I think in one hand, you're a writer, but in the other hand, you want to be a fan too, and remember why you love those books. And you'll never be able to do it as well as Vince did, but you want to be able to still give the fans the kind of things that made you fall in love with that book series.
Mm-hmm. And you said that you're going to be touring with Kyle and doing sort of a switch off. When is that going to happen?
So my fourth Clancy book comes out on the 5th of September, and his last Mitch Rapp book called Code Red comes out, I think, on the 11th of September. And so he and I will be, for 3 days, we'll be together going through the tour stuff, where we'll go into the Poison Pen first, that I think is maybe the 11th of September out in Scottsdale. And then every Vince Flynn tour usually starts or kicks off in his home city of Minneapolis. And so Kyle and I are both going up to Minneapolis the next day and doing a bunch of events there. And then we're coming to Austin, my hometown, to do some events there. So for a couple days in September, he and I will be chasing each other through the airport.
And do you know, I lied when I said that was my last question. Do you know who's going to be taking over Jack Ryan Jr.?
Yes. I cannot tell you. Yes, I do know. No, I can't say it yes yet, but I think the fans will be pretty happy once they announce it. They're a fantastic writer, and it's in good hands. And for the Jack Ryan Senior series, that's changing over as well, and they've already announced that. So it's the Andrews and Wilson guys who have a whole bunch of their own books, and they wrote in the W.E.B. Griffin world, and are now taking over the Jack Ryan's. And what's really cool about their first book, and I can talk a little bit about it because they've announced it, is so they are both Navy veterans. And so Brian Andrews was actually a submarine officer. And so the 40th anniversary of Tom's first book, Hunt for the Red October, will be when their first book comes out. And so it is going to be a submarine story. And so they've gone and done all this research and wrote around on new Navy submarines and stuff. So it should be pretty fantastic.
Wow, I will look forward to that, but I will also look forward to your next adventures as well. So thank you, Don. This has been so enlightening. I really did not go where I thought it was going to be, but so interesting.
So you thought it was going to be really dull, but it was interesting. It
Oh,
went.
no, no. I thought it would be more about the books, but it was really about your process, which I love. So thank you for taking the time to be with us, and for everybody who came and your questions and your attention. So I hope you all have a wonderful night, Dawn. We will see you on the road.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nina.
You're welcome. Good night, everybody.